stay unmuted if I'm actively chairing the meeting, but if somebody else is speaking and it's going to take a few minutes, I will mute myself just to minimize feedback.
Yeah. I will. I'll do that. I'm wearing headphones, so it shouldn't be a problem on my end. But
all right. The initial or kickoff meeting of the Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group meeting for Tuesday, October 6, 2020 will now begin.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota statutes, section 13D.021, due to the declared local health pandemic. For the record, my name is Greg Abbott. I am one of the co-chairs of the Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group. I will now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so that we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Ginder.
Present.
Commissioner Metke.
Present.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Clegg.
Here.
Co-chair Garcia.
Here.
Co-chair Abbott.
Present.
There are 6 work group members present.
Let the record reflect that we do in fact have a quorum. We will now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's Legislative Information Management System, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I please have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved. So moved. Second.
There is a motion and a second. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll on the agenda? Hearing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion for the agenda.
Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Metke.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner Clegg.
Aye.
Co-chair Garcia.
Aye.
Co-chair Abbott.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
That motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Item 3 on the agenda, which we've obviously gotten through items 1 and 2. I'm getting some feedback.
Mr. Chair, I'm working on that. That's members of the public who are with us.
Okay. We've obviously gotten through items 1 and 2, the roll call and the adoption of the agenda. Item 3 on the agenda is the purpose and parameters of the Government Structure Work Group. We're going to review the purpose and parameters, opportunities to improve the government structure of the city of Minneapolis. And let me just give you kind of I think for this item on the agenda, I think we need to look at 2 things, which is the scope of our review and the timing and deadlines that we face for our review. As I understand it, this was referred to us by the commission as a whole in response to some discussions that came out of the public safety work group, specifically with respect to the question of the balance between the mayor and the city council with respect to some of the government structure and operations. And so we've had some, I had some preliminary discussions with Commissioner Garcia about, kind of a larger scope, but I don't know that we have the mandate to do that. So I don't know that we have a mandate to talk about a city manager or city coordinator option or some of the other more exotic structure proposals that have kicked up in the past. We're looking at kind of the balance between the mayor and the council. And I don't know if Chair Clegg, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or anything to add.
We certainly talked at our last meeting about examining the options in a mayor-council system. And I think that full Charter Commission would have to weigh in if we wanted to expand that.
Okay. So at the moment, we are working on a mayor-council element. I don't know if we need to make, I would entertain a motion to that effect. The scope of this review is to evaluate the relationship between the mayor and the city council. Does somebody want to make that motion?
Move Ginder.
I'll make that motion, Metche.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
And Chair Abbott, could I add a caveat?
Absolutely.
This isn't part of the motion, but I would say that as the conversation continues, if it opens up other areas, that we bring it back to the commission and possibly explore and expand our scope, because I can see how that will happen as we discuss this further.
Absolutely. And I think that a motion to do something like that would be in order pretty much at any point in the business as we conduct it. So with that caveat, is there any other discussion on the motion? Okay, hearing no discussion, I think we should vote on the motion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Ginder,
Aye.
Commissioner Metke,
Aye.
Commissioner Smith,
Aye.
Commissioner Clegg,
Aye.
Co-Chair Garcia.
You're
Co-Chair
muted.
Garcia,
Aye.
Co-Chair Abbott.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
Okay, we have established our scope. The next question is the question of timing. How long do we have to work? What is the deadline for our work product? Presumably, our work product will be either a recommendation and a final report to the Charter Commission as a whole. I'd like to recognize Chair Clegg, who has his hand up.
Thank you. A question for City Clerk Carl. Just working back from an absolute deadline, if we were to propose an amendment, I believe that would have to be proposed by early August in 2021 to be on the ballot, early August at the latest, perhaps earlier to include a city council cycle. So maybe that's the place to start, is to figure out what the absolute deadline is and work back from there.
Chair Clegg, yes, I believe you are correct. I can't commit to a firm date. I haven't looked out that far ahead at this point, but I would be happy to put pencil to paper and come up with a calendar based on next year's general election in November and have that available to members prior to the next work group meeting so that there is a known timeline to address as part of the work plan.
Thank you. I would imagine that we would be done well before then, because if we were to propose an amendment to the charter, the full commission would have to hold at least one public hearing. And if it were a significant amendment, I imagine we would want to hold more than one.
I have a question for the city clerk, which is, as I understand the process for a charter amendment that's proposed by the Charter Commission itself, the city council is the body that determines the final language that goes on the ballot in terms of a description. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, you are correct. The council decides the language of the actual ballot question that is submitted to voters.
So let's, pending the information we're going to get from the city clerk on the timeline, I would propose a tentative deadline of July 1st for the final product, we're reserving, I believe, about a month for the process of the council to come up with a description, if in fact we produce a proposed charter amendment. And if we include, say, 3 public hearings, that would probably be a minimum of roughly 3 scheduled meetings or 3 months for the Charter Commission as a whole to process this, which would take us back, I believe, to maybe, June, May, April. So April 1st, so as a tentative schedule, we would need to provide our recommendation to the commission as a whole on or before April 1st of next year. As a tentative schedule, does anybody have any comments to add, or do you disagree with that proposed tentative schedule?
Commissioner Abbott, I think at this point, it's being so early. That sounds fine. I think we can have something pretty open and just keep these benchmarks in mind.
Okay. I mean, and obviously this is tentative. I don't think we need to have a motion to formally adopt a tentative. I just wanted to,
Correct.
for the purposes of trying to structure what we're doing here, I just wanted to get a sense of what the schedule looks like. I personally would like to get this done before April 1st. My internal clock, I feel like the middle of January or middle of February might be a more realistic goal. I don't think we're going to be, I mean, I feel some sympathy for the public safety work group because they're on the 90-day deadline. I mean, the commission as a whole is on the 90-day deadline to respond to the council's proposed amendment. We don't have that, but I don't think that means that we should kind of loiter around aimlessly until the last minute. So, so unless anybody has any further comments about kind of adopt that as kind of a rough guide, and when we get the information from the city clerk, I think we can kind of establish a more direct schedule. I think that covers everything under purpose and parameters of the government structure work group, the item 3 on the agenda. Is there anybody else have any discussion or comment on item 3 of the agenda? Okay, I think with unanimous consent here, I think I'm going to move on to item 4 on the agenda, which is a work plan and a timeline to guide the review, evaluation, and report to the full charter. Some discussions about the overall timing. And let me, my concept on a work plan, and Commissioner Garcia and I have kind of kicked this around a little bit in preparation for the meeting. And Chair Clegg, of course, is also kicked around with. We have, I think, I think we have some areas that we should examine, and I don't know if we should dedicate a specific session to each of these topics, but and I'll just throw these out as topics of discussion in terms of how I think we should approach this. I think one of the things that we should do is get some information on the history and background of the charter as it exists. One of the interesting elements of the Minneapolis Charter is it doesn't seem to have ever had a consistent organizing principle. As I understand the history of the charter, it was a whole bunch of state statutes were governing the operation of Minneapolis, and there were several efforts to try and codify it into a single document, which all failed, which resulted in 1920 an adoption of a charter, which basically just took all the language from the state statutes and threw it into a charter, and was therefore adopted as the city charter without any rhyme or reason or particular forethought. And that happened, 100 years ago, apparently, on September 24th. And since that time, we've had obviously amendments back and forth, and then of course we had the plain language charter amendment. About 10 years ago now, and 7 or 8 years ago, I guess. And the plain language charter amendment did a wonderful job of cleaning things up and dealing with a lot of the archaic cruft left over from this chaotic historical process. But I do think the one issue with a plain language charter amendment is it makes think look more organized than it really is. And I think the question of, as we examine the balance between the mayor and the city council in terms of legislative, executive authority and whatnot, I think we should have get some information about, was this balance that we have now intended? What was the purpose of it? What is the back, how, what are we changing? Are we interfering with some sort of scheme that we should be aware of before we propose anything? I should add, Commissioner Metke has her hand up, and I'll go ahead and recognize Commissioner Metke at this point.
Thank you, Chair Abbott. I don't mind coming in after you're done with your whole presentation if you want, but I was just going to suggest that maybe we bring in former Commissioner Brian Melendez to talk about the process of the plain charter. That was a 9 to 10 year process by the Charter Commission, and having served during that entire time, it was pretty thorough and investigative. And one of the things that we made a decision on was whether or not to make any substantial charter changes, and we decided not to just focus on the plain charter amendment rewrite with non-substantial changes. But we also said that we'd be willing to open it up for substantial changes and public hearings once we were through. And that's sort of like where we are now, looking at some substantial changes. But I think an overview by Brian Melendez would be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree completely. And as a matter of fact, he was on my list. There are some other folks I have in mind too, and we can go through that. I mean, obviously, if anybody wants to propose witnesses, feel free to send an email to Commissioner Garcia and myself. And we're gonna. I mean, I think we're gonna witnesses information. It's not really sworn, I guess, from a legal standpoint. But yeah, let's. I think there are a number of people I think we could talk to in terms of history and background, and I think that's very important to kind of set the parameters for what we're going to do later on in this work group. Commissioner Garcia, please.
Yeah, I'd like to. Perhaps this is too fine a point, but say history and background with a focus on the mayor-council structure, because we could go down a rabbit hole, I think, potentially, because it could be potentially very fascinating. But to look at to keep the focus on the mayor-council structure, is that what it's always been? Have other options been considered, and why? Things like that.
Sure, absolutely. I think that is a good clarification. Commissioner Ginder, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I saw Commissioner Chair Clegg's hand was up too, but I'm just going to say I'm not sure that it's really necessary to have Mr. Melendez appear, and this is acknowledging the tremendous work that he did in putting together the plain language charter. But we have a section who were present the entire that project went on. And from my personal experience, before I was on the commission, I represented the city for the entire time that we were putting together the plain language charter. So the putting together of the plain language charter, I think, members of the commission can explain that. That's different from the history of the relationship between the mayor and the city council. And when we did our work a couple of years ago on the first council amendment, we did some work on the relationship and the amendments that touched upon the relationship between the city council and the mayor. But there is also a long history of, for example, the League of Women Voters and work that they did 20 years ago proposing a strong mayor system. There's the history of when Don Fraser was in and changed started to give the executive committee. So there's a long history of how that relationship plays out that is probably just as much a research topic as trying to have somebody explain the various factions of what went on during the last 100 years. So I'm just kind of throwing that out.
No, and I should say I agree completely with the idea that we should talk about some of the proposals. I think some of the additions and amendments that were done in the Fraser era, I think, are worth talking about too. So I think that's all should be included. Chair Clegg has his hand up. Chair Clegg.
Yes, thank you. I was going to suggest that we all take a look at Eric Nathanson's book, Minneapolis in the 20th Century. The first chapter or two is all about the history of the charter. When that book was first published, I got permission to reproduce the first chapter and give copies to all charter commissioners. And some of you who have been serving long enough will remember getting copies, but I'm going to take that permission as still existing, and I can print out more, or we can all share copies. But that is a very detailed history of what went on leading up to 1920, about the various proposals that failed, and about charter history since 1920, including Mayor Fraser's effort to change the charter in the early 80s successfully, ultimately. I think there might be limited value in talking about the plain language charter because we were very careful during that entire process not to affect the relationship between the mayor and the council. So I don't think there were any substantive changes as it relates to the relationship between the mayor and the council. But I think we would all learn something, even if we've read it before, from taking a look at the history of the charter, because there was a lot of back and forth. Some of the efforts that failed before 1920 were basically a strong mayor system. So I think it would help us to gain some perspective.
Yes, that sounds excellent. I would imagine that we should get some copies of that printed out and distributed. Is the book available for sale, Chair Clegg? I mean, is it Amazon? Can you get it on Amazon, or is it?
I just called it up, and apparently it's $15.84. Yes.
I think I can spring for that.
It's
but
Iric, spelled I-R-I-C, Nathanson, Minneapolis in the 20th century, the growth of an American city.
Well, I would suggest if any members of the work group or other commissioners want to review a copy and don't want to buy the whole book, that they contact Chair Clegg and see if we can generate a few copies of our own. But
I have a number of hard copies in my office where I have not been for 6 months, but.
Well, hopefully you won't have to dodge airborne virus particles to retrieve them. Commissioner Rubenstein has had her hand up patiently.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually had a very similar suggestion. So that is when I joined the Charter Commission, I found a number of articles by Iric Nathanson in MinPost, the Hennepin History Museum magazine, and other places that also talk about the history of the charter. So I just wanted to add that to Chair Clegg's suggestion. I just Googled him, and those articles are available online.
Very good. We'll make that a point of getting those articles for ourselves online. Is there any other discussion on history and background before I move on? Okay, that is item 1, I think, for my work group plan. Item 2 on my work group concept, we should get some information about the current operation of the structure of the city. I think it would be useful to talk to both current city staff and elected officials on how the current structure works, how the current balance between the council and the mayor works. You know, and I mean, we all have lived in Minneapolis for a long time. I think we all have kind of maybe a superficial sense of how it all works or what a strong council system looks like. But I think we should start maybe with the Schoolhouse Rock version of how things happen in Minneapolis and maybe dive in a little deeper from that. I think it would be helpful to know what we're reacting to or what our proposals will affect in the current operation. And I don't know if anybody has any good ideas for people to come in and talk to us about that. Certainly, our city clerk would be helpful, I imagine, if he would want to make a presentation. But if there's anybody else, I'm more than willing to listen to suggestions. We also have Commissioner Metke's got her hand up.
I was just going to suggest that maybe a few city clerks we could talk to, because my observation in working in neighborhoods for 30 years is that relationship is really dependent upon the leadership and the folks at the time. And so different examples from different administrations might be very helpful and interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I would think that we would want to talk to people who are actually doing the nuts and bolts of this. I mean, I think it's easy to talk to. I mean, I do want to get some feedback from elected officials because that's important, but I do think that how the city runs is very much kind of a staff operation. I think people who've got their hands involved in the day-to-day on the city side and staff side, I think would be very important to talk to. Perhaps some people that don't really have a large public profile, but probably really know precisely what's going on, you know, inside the building. So, Commissioner Clegg, you've got your hand up as well.
Yes, I think it would certainly be useful to talk to city staff, but in terms of some sensitive questions, that may be of limited use, because they know their bosses are listening. And if we want to ask questions about, you know, whether one party or another has interfered with their job, or if things like that would be sensitive questions for them to answer, that may be problematic. What I would suggest we consider incorporating as part of our process is perhaps some sort of confidential written survey that we would submit to department heads. We would have to ask probably the mayor to let department heads know that they would be authorized to complete that. But where we could ask some of the more sensitive questions, and the answers, or not the answers, but at least the respondent's name could be anonymous. I think that might give us some more candid responses than asking them to speak out in an interview with the work group.
I think that's an excellent idea. Is there, would you or some group of you and others be willing to draft such a document?
Yes, certainly I'd be willing to work on that.
Okay. Well, obviously, feel free to involve anybody that you need to, but I think that would be great to get at least a draft of that for review before we send it out. And of course, I think we'll have to initiate some conversations to be able to get the permission to do that.
Could I ask a question about that?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm just wondering about the Data Practices Act. I mean, it seems to me that the information that you're asking or saying that you might keep confidential is likely public information. So I guess I would have some concerns about what we're telling people.
I mean, we could certainly consult with the city attorney's office, but at least the way I would envision it is respondents wouldn't even have to give their name. They would be able to respond without identifying themselves. So even if we did have to make those responses publicly available, it would not disclose the identity of the respondent. But I see Commissioner Ginder has his hand up, and he probably knows more about this than I do.
Yeah, Commissioner Ginder. You're muted, Commissioner Ginder.
I think Commissioner Smith has raised a good point here, because even though the responses may come back without a name on it, it'll be public information to whom we sent it to. So if we have a list of 42 department heads, deputy directors, whatever, that list will be public of who we sent it to, and then people will be engaged in their process of trying to figure out who the respondents are. For example, if we ask, are you in charge of a department that has more than 500 employees, or summarize the nature of your department's mission. People will start trying to figure out who said what. So, I mean, I think it's an idea worth exploring, but that there's going to be a guarantee of confidentiality is probably a little strong. There'll be a hope of it for the responses, but who we send it out to, I'm pretty sure will be public.
Well, I would think that that would be something we'd have to address as we draft and design the questionnaire. I think a lot of those objections we can solve in advance. So we've got a bunch of people with their hands up. Ms. Bashoon has her hand up. You've got some thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, the Data Practices Act does look at surveys, but it is citywide. I don't know if just going to department heads would be citywide. It does protect that data if it's citywide. We've also lost in a Department of Administration issue because we tried to protect survey data and it was not citywide, and we were told we could not protect it completely. So I'd have to look at what happened in the past. And I know that I think there was a lawsuit where we were sued based on a person actually putting in some words, and those words were provided to the public without a name attached. And based on how that person worded the sentences, management could tell who said it, and there were some claims of retaliation based on answering the survey. So I just wanted to let you know there are some issues surrounding surveys, and I can look into them, and I could work with this work group to make sure that we try to do it the best that we can without going awry of the Data Practices Act, and to try to protect the anonymity. But as Commissioner Ginder said, it might be not 100% possible to protect anonymity, but I can work with the group on that. Okay.
Great. Commissioner Metke had her hand up. Do you have anything to add, Commissioner?
Nope, it's down. It just was answered. I was going to ask a question and refer to a past survey, so it was answered. Thank you.
Thank you. And our esteemed city clerk, Mr. Carl, had his hand up briefly. Is there anything you need to add?
Not on this subject, Mr. Chair. I was going to suggest that in the last 2 elected cycles, I have coordinated and produced an elected official orientation manual, the contents of which may be instructive. I'm not going to say that what we've outlined there in terms of how the government is structured is necessarily how it operates, but in theory, the orientation manual lays out the relationship between mayor and council, between mayor, council, and staff, and talks about the different, at a high level, roles and responsibilities between those different parties of the city government, and it might be sort of a grounding document to refer to.
I think that's an excellent idea. And I don't know if you've got I know you've probably got some sort of virtual folder to collect documents related to this work group. If you wanted to just kind of put that document in there, that would be helpful so we could all access it.
Sure.
Thank you. All right. Any other comments on information on the current operation element of our information gathering? Okay. It seems to me the third element of the information we need to gather, or the third part of the work plan, would be gathering information about comparable cities and the government structure for comparable cities. And we've informally kicked around some examples. The only one I think that we're all relatively comfortable with in terms of examining its comparison would be our sister city across the river, St. Paul. My understanding is they went to a strong mayor system in, I think, the late 60s, and then 15 years later went to a part-time council structure. And I think it would be useful to talk to them about their experience since that. They obviously operate in the same statutory and regulatory environment that we do, so I think some of their experience would be useful for us. Are there any other cities that anybody thinks ought to look at as a peer or a comparable in terms of what their government structure is like? Commissioner Clegg has got his hand up. Commissioner Clegg? No. Ginder, you had
Sorry
your hand up.
about that. I was on mute.
Oh.
In 2018, we looked at a number of comparable cities in terms of size, basically looking for what kind of authority the council had over police departments. So it's slightly different analysis, but we did, I think Commissioner Ginder did most of the legwork, and it was probably at least 10 jurisdictions, maybe a few more. I think we could, I'm not volunteering you, Commissioner Ginder, but that would be a good place to start since we've looked at those before. We know they're of comparable size. I think mayor council systems. So, and we have some familiarity with them already from our previous work. So that might be a good list to start with.
Okay, Commissioner Ginder, you put your hands up.
I was just going to mention that also. And there are, I think, between 15 and 20 cities on that list. That list was split somewhere 50-50 between city manager cities and strong mayor cities. Portland being a commission city, the only one of its kind in the country. But I would be willing to take that on and just kind of go through that list of, I think it's approximately 9 or 10 comparator cities that have strong mayor systems, and just kind of a little more detail about what the language is in their charters, and what the relationship in a slightly broader scale is between them and the city council.
Okay. Are we aware of any city that has a government structure which is comparable to Minneapolis? Are we just a unique entity?
We're relatively unique. Most of the cities in the country of any size break down generally into a council manager system or a strong mayor system. You'll find the council manager system primarily in the South. It's more of a modern take on what people were trying to do. And most of your strong mayor systems tend to be in the Midwest and Northeast, but they are also in the West and in the South also. Like I said, Portland is the only city with a commission of any size. And we're kind of in that in-between strong mayor, strong council system. Then we have that little mix with the city coordinator thrown in, which is kind of a weak attempt at a city manager.
Right. Commissioner or Garcia, you have your hand up.
You're on mute.
I believe Casey may have some cities in mind that the city clerk's office is used before for when it comes to comparable cities as ours.
Commissioner, yes, we do have a list that we look at, and most of those are on the list that Commissioner Ginder referenced as well. I don't know and would work with Commissioner Ginder to make sure, but as an example, as a large city in the upper Midwest, Milwaukee also has a council mayor structure of government. It's very similar to ours, and so Milwaukee tends to be one that we would look at, and then the other two that we look at frequently are, ironically, Washington, D.C. as a 13-member full-time council, full-time mayor, and Denver, same kind of thing. So I think those might be on the list.
Thank you.
And Casey, those all that information was the stuff that Commissioner Ginder is talking about was analyzed as part of the 2018 proposal. Is that stuff? I mean, we can probably still find that in the city's data, right?
Correct. It's out in LIMS today,
Okay.
and Commissioner Ginder generated it all to begin with. So I know he has it, and if not, I can certainly get him a copy of his original work.
Okay. Well, let's we'll all part of our homework assignment will be for us to dig that stuff out on our own, and if we have some problems, we'll talk to you or Commissioner Ginder. Is there any other discussion on comparable cities? I mean, obviously, we've got some work to do on that and to look at that. But any cities anybody wants to add to the list? Okay. The next area that I think we should have as part of our work plan is we obviously at some point need to consider an alternative arrangement for. There needs to be some effort at considering alternatives. What would an alternative structure for Minneapolis look like? I mean, this is the point where we're going to, this is perhaps the point right before we start putting a draft together. So I think we should probably dedicate at least one or two work group sessions to, okay, we've accumulated this data, and out of all of this data, what alternatives make sense? So that seems to me to be kind of a penultimate step. And then of course the last step would be, of course, putting together a final report and a formal recommendation for the Charter Commission as a whole. And so those 5 elements, the history, the current operations, the comparable cities, the drafting or consideration of alternatives, and then the final report and recommendation. Those are the 5 elements I think that ought to go into our work plan. Are there any comments on that? Anybody think that we should add anything to that? Commissioner Garcia, you're on mute again.
At some point, I think it may be helpful to take a look at what is it about the current structure that seems to be not working as well as we would like it, and what is it we want from a structure? I don't know that changing the structure just to change it is very prudent, but I think if we can take a look at what is it about the current one that could be improved, and what kind of structure would be able then to satisfy those improvements for what we are looking at doing?
Right. I mean, I think that comes up in, when we talk about the current operation element, when we develop information, that's, does the current structure work, I think is kind of the inherent question that goes into that. And of course, obviously that also does the current structure work? Does it not work? How is it dysfunctional if it is? That obviously I think is part of the alternative consideration part too. So, but I agree with you. That's we shouldn't get lost on our focus there. Anybody else have anything to add in terms of work plan, the work plan to-do list?
Mr. Chair, this is Casey. I don't know if anybody else is in line, but and forgive me if I'm out of line here. My thought process that I would offer to you all is, I think you've outlined a plan of attack for action items, and I think the one piece I think that might be missing for your consideration is it might be helpful when we get to decision-making time if there was a sort of framework or values against which you could make. So if you're evaluating the city of Milwaukee and you like something about it, or the city of St. Paul, or the city of whatever, when I think about charter and governance, like writing a constitution, I think about values such as representation, and how much does the question of representation and how much representation weigh in, and how do we ensure an appropriate level? What does that look like? Leadership and direction, where does that come from? And what's the value of leadership from a singular executive versus a plurality of a body versus the combination between the two? You also have, I think, accountability, who's in charge, who makes the decision, and what's the check and balance against those things. And then from a staff perspective, I think one of the values would be sort of operational efficiency and professionalism, and balancing that operational efficiency and professionalism against political representation and political effectiveness. There's effectiveness from a political representation standpoint, and there's a political or a professional efficiency. And I think that's the question that you get into a strong mayor and manager versus council, even commission, right? On a sliding scale on each of those values, what's the right mix? And I'm not saying those are the only values, but those are sort of, as I'm off the top of my head thinking about it, things that I would suggest this group might want to put some initial thought into. And then as you are gathering that data and reviewing how other jurisdictions have framed their constitution, their charters, you can evaluate what points you like against that framework.
Okay, I think that's very well taken. I agree with you completely. I think the larger question is, where do we put it into our process? Chair Clegg, you had your hand up briefly, or you still do, actually. Go ahead.
I did, but I took it down. I think that should also be incorporated into our process, and it could be a subpart of some of the elements we've already discussed, but it should come early in the process, I think, so we can focus on those values as we go through the rest of our analysis.
So if I've got my 5 elements here, do we want to break out a separate work group session? Let's start with history and background specific to council mayor issues, and then perhaps the second session we should devote on criteria for evaluation, the value question. Kind of insert that between 1 and 2, and then proceed as with the issues I've outlined. Does that seem like a reasonable addition?
That makes sense to me. Because I think as we look at the history and background and learn from the past, we may see some themes that can help clarify those.
Okay.
Chair Clegg, were you going to offer something?
No, I think we got the visual thumbs up from Chair Clegg, so I think he agrees with the idea. I mean, I'm not the most skilled person in interpreting hand gestures, but I think that was a positive one. Any other discussion then? So what we've got then is a work plan, and in order, our work plan is number 1, history background relative to council mayor issues. Number 2 would be criteria for evaluation and kind of the values that we want to promote as part of this process is the number 2 item for the work plan. The number 3 item would be an assessment of the current operations of the city structurally. Number 4 would be a look at comparable cities. Number 5 would be then a consideration of alternatives or an effort to draft some kind of proposal that would address what we've discovered up to that point. And then the 6th and final element of the work plan would be to produce a final report and a formal recommendation to the Charter Commission as a whole. Does that seem reasonable for everyone? Any discussion on that at all? Commissioner Garcia.
I think another thing that Casey brought up, and we can put this when it comes to gathering information from similar sized cities, is if, as we look at the list that Commissioner Ginder had and the city clerk have put together, if there are national organizations that focus on local government that could be particularly useful. Not just a lit review, but something that could really speak to the core of what we're going for.
Okay. Absolutely. We'll put that into the hopper in terms of information requests. I think the next item is what I propose. I don't know that we need to do a formal motion on a work plan right now. What I suspect I will do is that Commissioner Garcia and I will put together a draft work plan. And at our next meeting, the first item of the agenda will be to go ahead and approve the work plan that we've just discussed here. We can amend it, obviously, at that point. But without having a written document in front of us to really pivot off of, I don't know that a vote right now would be a useful exercise. Which brings the next question, or the last question, I think, for the afternoon is, when should our next meeting be, and does it make sense? I know the public safety work group for a while was meeting every week. I don't know that we need to do that, given that we have we're not quite under the deadline that they were under. But should we go ahead and maybe schedule the next meeting for a couple of weeks from now? And does Tuesday afternoon still work? I think we'll need to talk to the clerk and Chair Clegg about if we get our own day of the week or if we have to work around public safety or not.
I think we want to check with public safety, because I know that even though the members of the 2 work groups are unique, a lot of commissioners like to join in whether they're in the work group or not. So.
Right. No, I definitely don't want to overlap with public safety. What's the current public safety work group schedule right now? Are they going back to every Tuesday at this point? Or I know they were off today, which is why we grabbed this date, but.
I know they're meeting next week. I'm not sure about the following week.
Okay.
Commissioner Rubenstein is on the line as one of the co-chairs of that group.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I think we're meeting next week, and I think we're meeting 2 weeks after that.
So you're meeting on the 13th and then on the 27th?
Yes, and I think we're not meeting on the 20th.
Okay. So I think does it make sense for us to go ahead and meet next on the 20th then?
I hope I'm right.
We've got the visual indication from Chair Clegg that is positive, so I think we're right about that. Well, if somebody wants to make a motion to schedule our next meeting for the 20th, I think that motion would be in order.
I'll make that motion. This is Commissioner Mecci.
I'll second Ginder.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? And I think, by the way, it goes with 4:30 as the usual time would be part of the motion as well. All those in favor? Well, I guess I should have the clerk call the roll on the question of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll ask for Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Metke.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner Clegg.
Aye.
Co-Chair Garcia.
Aye.
Co-Chair Abbott.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
Okay. Then I think the last question is, and I think this is more just an informational point, because I do think we need to schedule meetings, to the extent that we're going to get people coming to talk to us about history, background, and whatnot. Do we want to try and schedule that for our next meeting, or should we go ahead and talk to folks, other people? I've gotten some emails from some folks suggesting it. There apparently was a presentation at the Humphrey School that was very useful that has been recommended to me. And I can certainly try and schedule that for the next meeting on the 20th, or do we want to wait and then start the informational parts of the work plan after the next meeting? Is there any discussion or opinion on that? Commissioner Mecke.
Yeah, I would suggest that we move ahead with the informational part and save the presentation from the Humphrey a little bit later.
Okay.
I think we'd have a better be able to look at. I've seen it a couple of times, and I think we're able to look at it better the more information that we have on how the city is operating now and how it has in the past.
Okay. So let me ask you, I mean, do you think that our next meet, we ought to ourselves go back and look at the material we have, the book and the other articles online, and then discuss amongst ourselves what information we want, or do we want not to have anybody come and talk to us on the 20th?
I think maybe you could ask for people to text you those ideas, and between you and co-chair Garcia, you could probably come up with maybe a couple of people that could come in and talk to us.
Okay. Well, why don't Commissioner Garcia and I talk to some people and see if we can get some people coming in on the 20th, and if not, we'll see if we can get them scheduled for a later date. Chair Clegg has got his hand up.
I was just going to say that I will try and get out Eric Nathanson's first chapter in the next few days to everyone. So. Yeah.
So there was one of the people in the chat, I think it was has indicated it might be worthwhile to get Mr. Nathanson to come in himself. I think that would be an excellent idea. We'll work on that. Commissioner Mecke, you have your hand up still. Is that a duplicate, or do you have a new question? Nope. So, all right. I think the sense then is that we will make some inquiries and see if we can get some people in for our informational meeting in 2 weeks, and see what we can gather together information. And we're all going to do some homework and reading between now and then. That's all I've got. Commissioner Garcia, is there anything that you want to add?
Nope, there's not. That seems to cover it.
Okay. Last round of Ms. Bashoon has her hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to let you know that I did find a Minnesota Department of Administration advisory opinion. I sent you the link in the chat so you can look at that. That relates to surveys. Basically, I can let you know that the mayor and the city council members and department heads, they're all considered to be employees for purposes of the Data Practices Act. So any kind of survey data that they would provide would likely be private data. However, the data would have to be de-identified, which means you'd have to sit there and determine, would any of this data that is responding to the survey be able to let you know who provided that data. So I just wanted to give that to you so you can look over it, because that would relate to how the questions in the survey are created and how they're asked.
Okay. One point that occurs to me is that we should probably, before we talk to the mayor's office and see about getting permission for this, we should probably get our questionnaire drafted so that we have a specific document for them to react to, as opposed to, I don't know that we've really, I suppose we could just kind of vaguely let them know that something's coming, but I really don't think we could have a productive discussion unless we actually have a document with an actual, with actual questions on it. So, anything else? All right, seeing no further discussion, I think a motion to adjourn until the 20th of October would be in order.
Mr. Chair, rather than a motion, so we can avoid a roll call, we just have you say if there's no objection, you'll adjourn the meeting yourself.
Okay, if there's no objection, I will adjourn the today's meeting of the Government Structure Work Group. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.